No. You go.
So my first question is around how the Sprout was involved in what we've seen on display today.
Yeah. So you'll see a lot of what Nixi does is more around the workspace that she uses in Sprout. And so when we first started discussions with Nixi, a lot of her design work was already really using elements of Sprout. So she was already doing 3D scanning, she was doing a lot of touch manipulation and in and out of a bunch of apps on a PC typically, right? So the thing that Sprout's enabled her to do is that she's able to stick to one device. You know, she can take a color sample or a fabric sample straight into the digital realm without leaving Sprout. So that freedom of a workspace is something that Nixi really likes. And if you spend time with Nixi, you'll know, she's an incredibly creative person and her mind works quick. So she's always thinking about, well, so what's next? What could I do with that? What could I do with that? And the limiting factor when you don't have a workspace that you can do that collaborative in means that you have to stop-start. And stop-start to a creative person like Nixi, that becomes a problem because then you lose that flow, right? So Sprout takes a lot of that technology, the projection, 3D scanning, as well as the touch screen and the 20-point touch mat, means you don't have to go in and out of workspaces. So she can kind of complete a lot of her work in one space before she works on the next project.
Has Nixi used any 3D printing to go along with all this 3D scanning, and is HP going to be creating a Sprout 3D printer at some point?
So Sprout is the first product that we've got in what we call our blended reality. So this is an ecosystem to us where Sprout, being the first and foremost, is really about taking physical into digital and then back out again will eventually come. So HP's already made some announcements on 3D print. Mm-hmm. In terms of Nixi's use, yes, she's well and truly been using 3D, and you can tell that in her wearables. And a mixture of varying 3D printing technologies that she's been using. Hence why we've kind of wanted the involvement with her. That a lot of the learning that we get out of Sprout is because of the creative use, not necessarily the engineering elements that we put into it. And that's a big difference. HP's mission is to engineer experiences that amaze. But we need people like Nixi that really bring that to life, right? Sure. So that the engineering baseline is there, but when you watch someone with that creative capability, that's when you start to see, well, here is what the hardware and that software actually brings to life.
And just on the future, sorry guys, I know you announced 3D printing stuff in the future, yep. But talking about blended reality, I mean, we've seen all those virtual headsets with Microsoft's HoloLens with augmented reality. Yep. Is there an HP augmented headset that's going to help Nixi and everybody else using HP's technologies to blend reality even further?
Yep, so we've made some announcements with HTC that we'll be partnering on their headset as well.
With the Vive.
With the Vive, yeah. You'll start to see that come into the Australian market later in this year. So again, some really exciting stuff on exactly what that will be. Not in a workspace per se, but what people will be able to bring into their lounge room as well, which is pretty exciting stuff.
I'm sure there'll be another exhibition for us to look at in a few months' time.
Try our best. Yep.
So where do you actually see the Sprout? Because we've seen the fashion side, but let's talk about the normal consumer tech.
Yep.
Where do you see this? Education, in business, any other sorts?
3D silly putty,
Look, and I think that's the great thing about Sprout is it doesn't really have a start and finish. Mm-hmm. There might be people that decide to buy a Sprout purely because they like the way that you sit in front of the machine and use it. And you have to think about, the immersion that a Sprout gives is kind of in this vertical realm, right? Where you're used to screens wrapping around you. Yeah. Sprout does it that way, which is very, very different.
Hi guys, can I interrupt for a minute?
Sorry.
Well done. Sensational. Where are you going to sit?
I'm not going to sit anywhere. I'm going to be your bodyguard to the left. Do you need a water or something? Or wine?
Gotta get you a drink. What do you want?
What do you want?
Or a wine?
Potentially.
A Pinot?
Could be tempted.
Delicious.
Done. Alright. Be nice to her until I get back.
Congrats. You were sensational show.
So what did you think when you first saw the Sprout? I mean, your mind must have been going at 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Yes, totally. What can I do with this incredible, ridiculous thing? What?
Have you always looked at using different technologies in your designs? Is that something that you've always looked at doing?
Yeah, for me it's always been kind of a conversation between technology and nature, and a lot of the time that seems to come out in a way almost imitating nature in a lo-fi. I found that using high-tech technology to to kind of imitate nature in a lo-fi way. Like you can kind of see some of those things, like that dress had all of those light diamonds all over it, and those are interfaced to, they've got like data programming so that the color coding and stuff like that happens in certain sequences and that kind of stuff. So that's really where I'm interested in like, I guess, pushing those boundaries and really harnessing technologies that exist to be able to create things that don't exist yet. Like that's where Sprout comes in. Like, what, using something like that to be able to work on, oh, stop calling me.
Woman in demand tonight.
Yeah, but I mean, utilizing that kind of, I guess that's, in terms of your question or statement, like that was the most amazing thing when I first saw it. And they were like, oh yeah, you know, it does this, and this. I'm going like, does what now? does what? All of the things. Like you can see from that collection, I don't know if you've ever seen any of my past stuff, but you can see that it's just like totally tightened up all of the screws. Like it seems like before that all the layers were floating really far apart and maybe were a little bit disparate. And it's just something that's really completely streamlined my process to be able to have a really resonating rhythm or something to it, which I think is, like for me, it's phenomenal to see that collection. It's twice as big than I've ever done before, and it just feels like it's so much more resolved than ever before.
3D printing is nothing new. We've seen 3D printed dresses, and you may have done some stuff with that in that regard. And 3D scanning is obviously new, but did you have any 3D printed elements in any of the designs tonight?
In this collection, no. We actually had a few 3D printed items that didn't make it onto the runway. That always happens, right?
Yeah.
Crazy times. Yeah, you should see the studio right now. Damn. It's
how do you think this technology will evolve over the next few years? I mean, where do you see it going?
Oh, I totally should brought that book.
You want a book?
No, let's go. But I think there is this whole new wave of, especially in fashion and in the creative industries, of really dissolving those boundaries. So I think technology is playing a massive part in that, and in a way it has become the catalyst for, what's this word to say? Just like diffusing the creative space and allowing it to kind of just collide and jostle and become a lot more ambiguous, which I think is really exciting.
So when you were looking at the Sprout and you're like, oh, I can do this and this and this, was there something that you ended up doing that you didn't expect to be able to do?
I think there was a lot of like, I found that it was amazing for things that I already did, like a lot of kind of processes and things like that would take me a long time. But I found with this collection discovering like vectors. I mean, I know that's really basic, but I spent a long time doing really crappy ones, but Sprout just kind of like went, and I don't know, something it just, I think the combination of as well, like having this space, this space of the Sprout is what really makes it a really immersive space for a creative, because normally it's like you have all of these machines and screens and things, but you never really get to dive into them, or you have these interrupted interactions with them. So you do something with that one, something with that one, but nothing's resolved. You have to take the thing that you did with that over here to interact with this, and then it's this process that they all have to talk to each other for so long. By the time you get to the end of the conversation, it's sort of flattened out a bit. But being able to have that spontaneity and be really active in the design space immediately, that was what I found so incredible. And that comes out of like the projector and things like that, being able to capture and then reproject, and then being able to kind of be in this, you know, this book of dreams. It's super exciting.
So before, let's put this in comparison with what you used to do beforehand. How did, like, we talk about HP Sprout, what did you do beforehand? How was your process before that and before Sprout?
So before that, I would spend a lot of time, like you can probably see in those graphics, the whole collection, all the digital print comes from paintings of mine.
Yeah.
So I always have a lot of time where I paint. But if you can imagine taking a literal piece of paper, a painted piece of paper, and turning it into a digital, in a sense, it's kind of like a collage jam, because it has all these layers and that kind of stuff. But it has to go through so many things to get to that space. I've found the distance between the endpoint and the spontaneity and the kind of vibrancy and like vision of the painting is completely lost by, you know, having to translate it into a digital thing and then having to clean it up and then having to do this and then having to do that, then putting it into layers and all of that kind of stuff. It's such an extended process that it becomes, you get kind of, you've been painting and you've got this incredible clear vision and it's come out and you've got the end product, it's really exciting, and then you get halfway there, but it's turned into kind of an admin thing where you go make sure I get it off to a scanner. you know, you just lose the momentum.
Okay.
But it's like having that, you know, myriad of devices and kind of, I guess, features to be able to make that happen right then and there. Like, I literally, the pen is still wet, and I can go and get it all happening straight away, and you can get a visual result. You can kind of dive in there and make it actually happen when it's still happening in the real world, because otherwise that lag just means like,
What were the
That's an
programs?
interesting point as well. Like, you'd be able to use like wet mediums as well as dry
Totally,
mediums
yeah.
because you've got that distance. That's really cool.
Yeah, I'll go on, please.
I guess it's incredible because in that sense, a lot of things that are usually, you know, if you're digitizing something like that, usually, yeah, it's a 2D paper or a flat something. When you go into the realm of being able to capture projections in that kind of 3D space, you can get anything. And you can as well bend, like a lot of the 3D printing things that we didn't end up doing were like sort of bracelets and stuff like that. So we were scanning, like I would laser cut a 2D piece of like a repeat or something like that, and then you could bend it, whatever fabric it is out of, you know, laser cut it out of thermoplastic, bend it in the shape you want, reseal it, and then 3D scan it, and then you can play with that file. And it's like, if you think about how far you push an image, a lot of the time you're like, oh, okay, it's finished, but that's just because you don't realize there's all these other things you can do. So it's just like going beyond that. Before it was like, oh yeah, cool, you know, I just take this painting and I put it in here, and that's sort of my process. But now it's kind of just like, whoa, that is like this part of the whole journey of that image. It has so far to go, and there's so many, you know, there's so many elements in it I haven't mastered yet, I don't know how to use, or like, you know, I'm excited to dive into. But it's like, I think that that's the most exciting thing. It is just this holistic design space that can just actually take that real life situation and take it the whole way through the end. Which I think is
You can see this back to my point, what happens when we remove the stop-start from the creative process. So I think, you know, Nixi is an awesome example of how much, you know, creativity is there, but then you get bogged down in the, I've got to do that, then I've got to do that, and it's literally a stop-start again.
So what are some of the programs that you're using? Obviously there's the Sprout, the 3D scanning software, but what other programs do you use?
mostly Illustrator and Photoshop.
And they work with Sprout as well, like you do Sprout?
Yep.
Okay.
And then I do like a bit of stuff in Rhino and stuff like that as well, but mostly it's just using the Sprout interface.
How steep was the learning curve from sitting in front of that and actually starting to be productive with it? How long did it take to get comfortable?
I think there's just a lot of things that you know they're there, but you can't figure out where they are, if that makes sense. When it's like trying to teach yourself Photoshop and you've never been there before, and you're like, or if you're like, I'm a PC, I've used PC computers my whole life, so I was telling someone this the other day. I went before the shoot, I'm meeting with the production manager, and we're talking about images and stuff. He's like, oh, you know, bring that image up for me. I was like, okay, cool. And he hands me his computer, and I'm touching the screen going, dude, your computer's broken. And he's like, what are you doing? Get your fingers off my screen. And I was like, what? It doesn't, what? And he just sort of trying to zoom into things and touch stuff, and he was like, get away. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's really totally exploited the ability to continue on and capture that spontaneity and keep it. I think a lot of the time that just like drifts away.
So we're going to have to wrap up quickly with Nixi because she actually has to do this all again down at Fed Square tonight. So any last question?
Yeah, in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
It's all happening.
Any last questions for Nixi before we leave you with Paul?
Rock and
Best of
roll.
luck with tonight.
Thank you. I'm actually flying to Berlin in 5 hours. So
Oh, you are too.
see you guys later.
Amazing.
No worries.
So what do you have planned
Just
for?
left with me.
Yeah. So what do you have planned for Sprout 2.0?
Look, so I think a lot of no, it's
a natural question, you know, yeah.
right? Because and I think this is kind of a mirror almost of the.
It's going to have the 3D printer on the other side of it. You know?
Yeah. Is that where will the product take us? And I think that's whether it be the next iteration of Sprout or what we'll develop with that. A lot of that will be based on user feedback. You know, we deliberately took what was a fairly small footprint in this country because Sprout is not for every single person, but the people that it is for, we want to learn from. And touching back on your question, we've had some really surprising queries, a lot of university queries, a lot of engineering queries, as you might expect. A lot of people using it for things that we just never thought of before. You know, I've attended some conferences where I've had particular mining companies say, yeah, we just want this because we can send it as a part and then we don't have to describe it over the phone because downtime is very expensive. And trying to get someone to, you know, describe a part in the field versus just putting it on a map is money to us. So we would never have designed a product to do that in that specific case, but it's one that Sprout can be used for. And I think that discovery is one where, from an engineering point of view, the hardware is in place. The software will start to develop as we get more and more user feedback. But the reality is, as you find with Nixi, it's no longer the hardware holding them back. You know, that they've got all of that what they need. It's more the creative process and the flow of that. So our next version is not necessarily around, well, what will it be in terms of magical wands on hardware? It's how do we continue to develop so that we don't slow that creative process down, and then what particular verticals do we start orientating the product towards? So yeah, that might mean that there's not just one singular version, it's orientated towards particular verticals.
I mean, I can imagine a Sprout camera built into the back of your smartphone or tablet, so you're just sort of hovering something around your whatever it is you're trying to scan.
Yep.
And you know, the camera has to evolve to be that good. But
yeah, look, and I
it's
think
just
that's the 3D element of it. You know, we've found, and again, Nixi demonstrated this for us live. You know, because there is the two different surfaces there to use. You know, you've got a full touchscreen, and it's a full PC. So, you know, interaction with a Skype call whilst sharing the design map means you can draw and collaborate at the same time. So, you know, this doesn't necessarily always have to lead down a creative or an engineering process. It might be just around a collaboration. You know, if you can have one of these in remote offices, then all of a sudden your teams, you know, it's a big enough unit that 2 or 3 people can quite easily get around, and then they can draw live and share that image live. So they might be running a Skype call, they might be doing something else, and that's, you know, again, one of those cases where when we get user feedback, then we can start to augment the software to that kind of use case.
Are you looking at doing any more collaborations with people like Nixi, or even totally different types of creators?
Yeah, so I mean, you would have seen we've had a number of people we've been collaborating with. Nixi's first and foremost tonight, obviously with Fashion Week.
this is the first Sprout assisted fashion collection
that I'm aware of, yes, but I haven't checked that, so who knows what you guys might be doing.
Potentially.
It's the first one I'm aware of. Not
Yeah.
sure what
It's the
statistics
first Australian one.
Yeah.
It's the first Australian one,
Yes.
isn't it?
It's
Yeah.
definitely the first one we've done. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
because I mean anyone could have purchased it and used it for anything they wanted to.
Correct.
Yeah.
And look, we even had purchases coming in from the US that we knew people were keen to get a hold of the product. So
Well, what else do you know besides what you've explained tonight that people have done with Sprout that is really out there?
yeah, it's a good question, and there is a lot of stuff I don't know of because there's a lot of stuff that people won't tell us.
Sure.
And that kind of gives us a really good insight into, okay, they might be developing some IP that they really want to hang on to,
Sure.
but it's kind of cool that they're using that to develop it.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are, you know, that's really interesting, even though I can't find anything out about it and share it, but it's kind of like, well, if it's good enough for people to protect, then they obviously value it. So, you know, it's those kind of, when I hear those stories, you know, we see the units go out, and it's kind of like, cool, so what are you doing? You want to help you with it? No, we're good, thanks. Which is good. You know, we'd obviously love to know because we want to try and help customers, but at the same time, you know, they've obviously seen something in Sprout that again gets back to my main point of we're developing the software and the hardware to enable people to do stuff that we're not really sure what they're going to do. We understand some things, but you know, it's kind of cool.
That's what you want. You want people to be creating things.
Yeah, well, you know, we wouldn't have created the
unexpected.
product necessarily to say, hey, what we need is something for Fashion Week. But it's kind of cool that we're here, and that's what it's being used for, yeah.
Kind of like giving someone a bunch of ingredients and seeing what they cook.
Exactly right. And I mean, you know, if you use that same analogy, then there's, you know, some people make wildly different things out of the same ingredients, and that's kind of where Sprout starts to grow on you as to you know, what it could be used for. The times I have been lucky enough to be in the room and seeing someone like Nixi start from a blank canvas. I'm not a creative person. Thankfully, my job doesn't require too much of it in terms of painting and editing. But seeing what Nixi can do, and people that have that creative mindset, you sit back and you go, oh, I never would have thought of doing that.
Yeah.
You know, and even just from a simple drawing, right? It's kind of cool to see what the product can turn out.
And as you were saying before, your observation, you can scan wet paint.
Yeah.
You know, it's just insane.
Plates
You
of
know?
food. You can,
Yeah,
like,
anything.
it can be
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah,
we did a glass of wine and we got told to move the wine.
So you never know what people are going to use it for.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Put your face under there.
That's
Could you
it.
put your
Well,
face
I mean,
over there?
Okay.
Would it damage your eyes?
We actually had that question. It wasn't necessarily your face. It was.
well, I was imagining.
It was. I think they asked for body parts, and
Yeah.
thankfully enough, this was at an event we ran in Sydney. It was Ben Frost, another one of our influencers, that was doing some art at the same time. Now he had art on the touchpad in front of him,
Yeah.
and because the question was there, he's like, "Well, cool, let's try it," and scanned a tattoo on his arm,
Yeah.
and immediately brought that in as a new element.
Yeah.
So it was, hey, I'm not sure I'd stare at the bright lights for too long,
Yeah.
but certainly it's not going to harm you if you want
Yeah.
to scan something.
Yeah. I scanned my hand as well.
First thing you do.
It's like, ooh.
But we scanned Nixi the other day, like actually all of her with her tablet.
Oh, yes,
Yeah, and then she
Yep.
was like playing with herself in the back-turn phrase. But yeah, so cool.
I mean, you do see those places that print out little 3D versions of yourself.
Yeah.
Which we kind of have been doing. So we've had in acrylic, we've been 3D printing people's heads
Oh, wow.
with inside glass. You guys would have seen it. It's
Yeah, I've
technology
seen
powered
it.
by Intel.
Yeah.
And we were using our Spectre X2 with 3D RealSense to scan people's heads in 3D.
That's what
and
we
then print
use,
this
yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Which the funny joke in the office is I now have a 3D printed model of our finance director. So
Nice.
Looking at you.
entertaining every
Yeah,
day,
no,
yes.
you can't.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yes.
Oh, excellent.
And so, just tell us briefly, is this exhibition going to be held in Berlin?
Yes.
Right.
In terms
Yeah,
of the-
yeah, she's taking
yeah.
her collection there.
The
Yeah.
collection there.
So it's being reshown tonight in Fed Square,
Yes.
and then Nixi is going to Berlin and possibly elsewhere too.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great. Well, great publicity for HP.
Yeah.
And I think great for an Australian artist. as
Yeah,
well,
absolutely,
to-
absolutely.
To have this kind of collaboration, it's cool for us because it's obviously new and different, and something that is kind of worlds apart from necessarily the IT world, but kind of cool when you can bring it together.
Well, fashion and technology have been merging for some time, so
Yeah.
here's another example
I
of
guess
it.
that's the thing with every creative medium now. Like you see a lot of people using technology to do art in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Pretty
that
interesting.
makes sense.
Yeah, and which I think that when you kind of bring those two worlds together, then you kind of get a real, eye-opening light bulb kind of moment as to the cool. I never would have thought that we'd use that technology
You're
to do that.
giving artists a new medium
Yeah.
to work with.
Yeah.
They've been working with historically essentially the same tools
Correct.
for centuries, and now you're like, hey, you've also got this, and you're like,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, I can do this on my finger.
Sometimes it's not necessarily the medium; it's just
Yeah.
kind of taking out the stop-start as well. I mean,
Yeah.
drawing on the touchpad's kind of very similar to paper, but and this wasn't rehearsed. Just seeing Nixi
Yeah.
automatically dive into don't like the stop-start because then it becomes a task, and then in her mind that's like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. I'll start
Exactly.
over here.
For all its
Comes
advancements,
out.
it's almost like an extremely primitive version of the Star Trek holodeck.
Yeah, it is.
I'm sure Lucas has got some IP there, so
Well, I mean, that's Star Wars, but yeah.
sorry, Star Wars.
Yeah. Gene Roddenberry,
Yeah.
but he's
No, I can't get that.
All right, wow.
Thanks,
Fascinating.
guys.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
No, I really appreciate it.
Oh,